You know what drives me absolutely crazy? When people think basic courtesy is optional. I'm Jennifer, I'm 28, and I work in data processing at a decent-sized company. My husband Zach and I have been married for 3 years, and honestly, things have been pretty smooth sailing until recently. But there's this situation at work that's been eating at me for months now. This guy, Paul, and look, I'm not saying he's not attractive because he definitely is, has been completely ignoring me and my coworker Riley like we don't even exist. I'm talking zero acknowledgement, no good morning, won't even make eye contact when we're in the same hallway. Meanwhile, he chats with all the guys just fine. Like, what the hell is that about? When I first mentioned it to Zach, he gave me this look like I was being dramatic. Maybe he's just quiet, he said, not even looking up from his phone. Quiet? There's a difference between being quiet and being straight up rude. This isn't high school where you can just ignore people you don't want to deal with. We're adults in a professional environment, and basic respect shouldn't be too much to ask for. But apparently, my own husband doesn't see it that way. The thing that really gets me is how Paul acts like he's too good to even acknowledge our presence. He'll walk right past our desks every morning, literally has to pass us to get to his workstation, and acts like we're furniture. Not even a nod. But then I'll see him laughing it up with the guys from accounting, talking sports, or whatever. It's not like he's some antisocial weirdo who doesn't talk to anyone. He's specifically excluding the women, and that's not okay. Riley noticed it too, thank God, because I was starting to think I was going insane. He gives me the creeps, she told me during lunch one day. Like, why does he act so weird around us? Exactly. It's creating this uncomfortable work environment where we feel like we have to walk on eggshells around this guy who apparently thinks we're beneath his notice. When I tried explaining this to Zach again, he actually had the nerve to suggest that maybe Paul was just intimidated by us. Intimidated? Please. We're not asking him to write us love letters, just basic human decency. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. I mean, what kind of message does this send? That it's okay for men to just decide which women are worth acknowledging? That we should just accept being treated like we're invisible? Hell no. I've worked too hard to get where I am to let some guy make me feel uncomfortable in my own workplace. So Riley and I started paying closer attention, documenting the pattern. And it was definitely a pattern. He'd respond to male colleagues immediately, help them with questions, even crack jokes. But if we asked him something work-related, he'd give these clipped, minimal responses without even looking at us. It was textbook discriminatory behavior, and I wasn't going to stand for it. The frustrating part was how nobody else seemed to notice or care. When I mentioned it to some of the other women in the office, they just shrugged it off. Oh, Paul's always been like that, they'd say, like that made it acceptable. Well, maybe it was time someone actually held him accountable for his behavior instead of just enabling it. These women were part of the problem, honestly. They'd rather just accept poor treatment than rock the boat. And that's exactly why guys like Paul think they can get away with this crap. What really pushed me over the edge was this incident last Tuesday. I was at the printer when Paul walked up, clearly needed to use it after me. I smiled, said good morning, almost done here, normal human interaction. This man looked right through me like I hadn't even spoken. Didn't acknowledge me at all, just stood there with his arms crossed looking annoyed that I was taking up space. When I finished and stepped aside, he moved to the printer without a word, not even a thank you. I was so pissed, I could barely concentrate for the rest of the morning. That's when Riley and I decided we needed to take this to Mr. Henderson, our supervisor. We weren't asking for the guy to be fired or anything dramatic, just for someone in authority to have a conversation with him about professional courtesy and respect in the workplace. It's literally part of our company handbook that employees should maintain a respectful work environment. Paul was violating that policy and it needed to be addressed. But of course, when I told Zach about our plan that evening, he completely freaked out. "You're going to get the guy in trouble for not saying good morning," he said, like I was being completely unreasonable. "Jennifer, maybe you should just let it go. Some people are just different." Different? Different? No, Zach. Some people are just assholes who think they can treat women however they want without consequences. The fact that my own husband was taking this stranger's side over mine was honestly more hurtful than Paul's behavior. It made me realize that Zach probably didn't fully understand what it felt like to be dismissed and disrespected on a daily basis. He'd never had to deal with someone making him feel invisible at work, so of course it seemed like no big deal to him. But this wasn't just about hurt feelings. It was about standing up for myself and every other woman who's been made to feel less than by men who think basic courtesy is optional. The meeting with Mr. Henderson went better than I expected. He actually listened to our concerns and took notes while Riley and I explained the situation. We made it clear that we weren't trying to cause drama. We just wanted Paul to understand that his behavior was creating an uncomfortable work environment and affecting team morale. Mr. Henderson nodded along and said he'd have a conversation with Paul about professional conduct and workplace expectations. He thanked us for bringing it to his attention and assured us that this kind of thing was taken seriously. I felt vindicated, honestly. Finally, someone in authority was acknowledging that Paul's behavior was problematic and needed to be addressed. Riley and I left that meeting feeling like we'd actually accomplished something positive for the workplace culture. Maybe now, Paul would understand that ignoring your female colleagues isn't just rude, it's unacceptable. And maybe other women in the office would see that they didn't have to just accept disrespectful treatment from their male coworkers. But Zach's reaction when I told him about the meeting that night? Completely unsupportive. "I can't believe you actually went through with that," he said, shaking his head like I'd done something terrible. "That guy's probably mortified. What if he gets written up or fired?" What if he does? Actions have consequences, and if Paul didn't want to face those consequences, maybe he should have thought about that before spending months treating his female colleagues like garbage. But apparently, Zach was more concerned about some random guy's feelings than his own wife's work environment. "You're creating drama where there doesn't need to be any," he continued. "Some people are just quiet and keep to themselves. That doesn't make them bad people." "Oh, but trying to ensure a respectful workplace makes me the bad person?" The double standard was incredible. Zach would never tolerate being ignored and dismissed at his job, but somehow when it happened to me, I was supposed to just smile and take it. That conversation made me realize that my husband and I had very different ideas about what constituted acceptable behavior and mutual respect. After that meeting with Mr. Henderson, the energy at work definitely shifted. Paul started making minimal eye contact and would mumble "morning" when he passed our desks, but you could tell he was doing it grudgingly. Some of the guys in the office were giving Riley and me these looks. Not hostile exactly, but like they thought we'd overreacted. A few of the women seemed uncomfortable too, probably worried that we'd made waves they'd have to deal with later. But you know what? Sometimes making waves is necessary. Sometimes being the person who speaks up is uncomfortable. But it's still the right thing to do. I wasn't going to apologize for demanding basic respect and professionalism from a coworker. The fact that Paul could suddenly manage to acknowledge us when his job was on the line just proved that his previous behavior was a choice, not some personality quirk or social anxiety like people kept suggesting. He knew how to be polite, he just hadn't bothered before because he thought he could get away with it. The tension at home was getting worse too. Zach kept making little comments about the work situation, asking if things had calmed down yet, like the whole thing was some temporary drama that would blow over. He didn't seem to understand that this wasn't about drama, it was about principle. When I tried explaining that standing up for yourself isn't drama, it's self-respect, he'd get this glazed look like he was just waiting for me to finish talking. It was becoming clear that Zach had a pattern of dismissing my concerns whenever they involved any kind of conflict. He wanted to keep the peace at all costs, even if it meant his wife had to tolerate disrespectful treatment. That realization was honestly more disappointing than Paul's behavior had ever been. At least with Paul, I hadn't expected support or understanding. But Zach was supposed to be my partner. And instead, he was making me feel like I was wrong for standing up for myself. Things came to a head about 2 weeks after our meeting with Mr. Henderson. I was having lunch with Riley when she mentioned that she'd heard through the office grapevine that Paul had been having a rough time lately. Apparently, he'd been seeing someone in HR about workplace stress and had even taken a few personal days. "Maybe we should feel bad," Riley said, but honestly, I didn't. If Paul was stressed about being held accountable for his behavior, that was his problem to deal with. Nobody forced him to treat his female colleagues like they were invisible. Nobody made him create an uncomfortable work environment. Those were his choices, and now he was dealing with the consequences. When I mentioned this to Zach that evening, he completely lost it. "So you're happy that you made some guy miserable?" he asked. "What if he has anxiety or depression or something you don't know about?" "What if he does?" "That still doesn't excuse months of disrespectful behavior. Having mental health issues doesn't give you a free pass to treat people badly, and it definitely doesn't mean the people you've mistreated owe you sympathy." The conversation with Zach that night opened my eyes to something I'd been trying to ignore. My husband didn't respect my judgment or my ability to handle workplace situations. He automatically assumed I was wrong, that I'd overreacted, that I should have just accepted poor treatment instead of addressing it. When I pointed this out, he got defensive and started listing all the ways he supported me: paying for dinner dates, buying me gifts, helping with household chores. But support isn't just about money and tasks. Real support means believing in your partner's experiences and backing them up when they're standing up for themselves. Zach had failed that test completely, and it was making me question what other areas of our relationship involved him quietly thinking I was wrong, but not saying anything. How many times had he smiled and nodded while secretly believing I was being dramatic or unreasonable? The thought was honestly sickening. The final straw came during a dinner party at his brother's house 3 weeks later. Somehow the conversation turned to workplace dynamics, and Zach's sister-in-law mentioned a situation at her job where a male colleague had been unfairly targeted by female coworkers who complained about his communication style. I could feel Zach looking at me, and sure enough, he jumped right in. "Jennifer went through something similar recently," he said. "Sometimes these things get blown out of proportion." I sat there in complete shock, as my own husband essentially told his family that I'd made a big deal out of nothing. That my legitimate concerns about workplace respect were just me overreacting to normal behavior. He painted Paul as this poor, misunderstood guy who was just quiet, and me as the oversensitive wife who couldn't handle a coworker's personality. The worst part was how his family nodded along sympathetically, like they felt sorry for Zach for having to deal with such a difficult wife. I excused myself to the bathroom and just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. My husband had thrown me under the bus to make himself look reasonable and long-suffering. The drive home that night was silent until I finally asked him why he'd done that. "Done what?" he said, genuinely confused. When I explained how humiliated I felt, how unsupported, how betrayed, he actually had the nerve to say I was reading too much into it, that he was just sharing our experience, not taking sides. But there's no neutral way to describe someone as overreacting. There's no supportive way to suggest your wife made a big deal out of nothing. I realized in that moment that Zach had never actually believed my version of events. From day one, he'd thought I was wrong about Paul, wrong about the situation, wrong about needing to address it. He'd just been humoring me, waiting for me to get over it and move on. The fact that he'd chosen to air our private business to his family, painting me as the unreasonable one, showed me exactly what he really thought about my judgment and my character. It was devastating, but also clarifying. I finally understood that my husband didn't actually respect me or believe in me, he just tolerated me. About a month later, through a mutual friend who worked in HR, I found out the real story about Paul's workplace stress. Turns out he'd been dealing with severe social anxiety for years and had been working with a therapist on his interaction skills. The complaint Riley and I filed had sent him into a complete panic spiral because he'd been trying so hard to improve, but was terrified of saying the wrong thing to women after a bad experience at his previous job. Our friend mentioned that Paul had specifically asked for guidance on how to be more professional with female colleagues because he knew his behavior came across as rude, even though that wasn't his intention. He'd apparently been so stressed about our complaint that he'd had panic attacks and needed time off to adjust his medication. When I heard this, I felt nothing. Maybe I should have felt bad, but honestly, none of that was my responsibility. Paul's mental health struggles didn't erase the impact of his behavior on me and Riley. If he had social anxiety, he should have communicated that or asked for help sooner, instead of making his female coworkers feel uncomfortable for months. When I shared this information with Zach, thinking maybe now he'd understand the complexity of the situation, he looked at me like I was heartless. "So you're still not sorry?" he asked. This guy was obviously struggling, and you made his life worse. That's when I realized we were fundamentally incompatible. Zach saw Paul as a victim who deserved sympathy and protection. I saw him as an adult who was responsible for communicating his needs and managing his behavior, regardless of his personal struggles. Zach thought I should have just accepted poor treatment indefinitely, rather than risk making Paul uncomfortable by addressing it. I believed that creating a respectful work environment was everyone's responsibility, and that my comfort mattered just as much as Paul's. Neither of us was going to change our perspective, and I was tired of being married to someone who thought I was wrong for standing up for myself. The Paul situation had revealed something fundamental about who Zach was as a partner, and I didn't like what I saw. I filed for divorce 2 months later. Zach seemed genuinely shocked, like he couldn't understand how we'd gotten to that point. During our mediation sessions, he kept bringing up the work drama as an example of how I'd changed and become harder to please. His lawyer actually tried to use the Paul situation as evidence that I was difficult and unreasonable, suggesting that I'd created conflict in multiple areas of my life. It was surreal listening to them paint my decision to address workplace disrespect as some kind of character flaw. But it also confirmed that I was making the right choice. I wasn't going to spend my life with someone who saw my self-advocacy as a problem to be managed, rather than a strength to be supported. Through mutual friends, I eventually learned that Paul had transferred to a different department and was doing well with a new team. He'd apparently found his groove working with a smaller group where he felt more comfortable. Good for him. I also heard that Zach had started dating someone from his gym within 6 weeks of our separation, a quiet girl who supposedly never caused drama. Perfect. They deserved each other. The divorce settlement didn't go quite as smoothly as I'd hoped. Turns out Zach had been documenting our arguments, including recordings of me going off about the Paul situation. His lawyer used those to paint me as unstable and confrontational, which affected the financial settlement. I ended up having to sell the house we'd bought together and move into a smaller apartment. My legal fees were astronomical, and I'm still paying them off. But even with all that, I don't regret standing my ground. What I didn't expect was how the whole thing would affect my reputation at work. Word got around about my divorce, and somehow the Paul situation got brought up again. People started treating me differently. Not hostile exactly, but like they were walking on eggshells around me. I heard through the grapevine that some of my coworkers thought I was trouble, and that getting involved with me professionally might be risky. A few months ago, I applied for a supervisory position that I was more than qualified for, and they gave it to someone with less experience. When I asked for feedback, my manager gave me some bullshit about interpersonal skills and conflict resolution. It's frustrating how standing up for yourself can somehow become a mark against you professionally. But I refuse to let other people's narrow-mindedness define my career. I've been looking at positions with other companies, and I'm confident I'll find somewhere that values employees who speak up about problems instead of just sweeping them under the rug. The ironic part is that about 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I ran into Zach at the grocery store. He was with his new girlfriend, this mousy little thing who barely made eye contact and kept agreeing with everything he said. She seemed nice enough, I guess, but watching them together made me realize how different we really were. Zach wanted someone who would go along with whatever he thought was right, who wouldn't challenge him or make him uncomfortable. I needed a partner who would support me even when it was difficult, who would believe in my judgment even if they didn't always agree with my methods. As I watched them walk away, I felt genuinely relieved that I wasn't that girl anymore, the one who doubted herself when her husband dismissed her concerns, who second-guessed her instincts to keep the peace. Yeah, my life is messier now, and yes, some people think I'm difficult. But at least I'm living authentically, instead of pretending to be someone I'm not just to make everyone else comfortable. The thing that bothers me most about the whole situation isn't that my marriage ended or that people think I overreacted about Paul. It's that everyone expects me to feel guilty about standing up for myself. Riley still works in our department and occasionally mentions how peaceful things are now, like the previous tension was my fault rather than a result of Paul's behavior. Zach's family still treats me like I destroyed a good man over nothing. And I've heard through friends that he tells people I changed after we got married and became impossible to please. But you know what? I'm not responsible for managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. I'm not required to accept poor treatment just because the person giving it might have reasons for their behavior. And I'm definitely not going to apologize for expecting basic respect from my coworkers and support from my husband. I'm 28, I have a good job, and I'm finally free to find someone who actually believes in me, instead of just tolerating me. Everyone else can deal with their own issues while I focus on building a life where I don't have to fight for basic respect. Looking back now, almost a year later, I can see that the Paul situation was just the catalyst that exposed deeper problems in my marriage. Zach's inability to support me, his automatic assumption that I was wrong, his need to paint me as the unreasonable one to make himself look better. None of that started with Paul. Those were character traits that had probably been there all along, but I'd been too comfortable to notice them. The divorce was messy and expensive, and yes, it upended my entire life. But I'd rather be alone and respected than married to someone who thinks my standards are too high. Some people have suggested I should have handled the Paul situation differently, been more understanding, tried to approach him directly instead of going to management. Maybe they're right, but I'm not sorry for demanding professionalism in the workplace or for expecting my husband to back me up instead of undermining me. Those seem like pretty reasonable expectations to me, and if that makes me difficult, then I guess I'm difficult. At least I'm not pretending to be something I'm not, just to keep the peace anymore.